The chandeliers of the Palazzo Vittoria cast fractured light across 300 faces when Riccardo de Santis walked through the gilded doors with a woman who was not his wife. His fingers rested at the small of Valeria Conti's back, her crimson gown catching every camera flash, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. The whispers started before they reached the bottom of the marble staircase. Wives clutched their husbands' arms. Men who owed him millions suddenly found their champagne fascinating. Then the doors opened again. And every sound in that room died. Elena Varese stood in the entrance, draped in black silk that moved like smoke around her body. But it wasn't her dress that stopped hearts. It was the small hand clutched in hers. The child had his father's steel-gray eyes. And the room understood everything. The silence stretched like a blade pressed against skin. Riccardo's hand fell from Valeria's back as if burned. His jaw locked. His steel-gray eyes found Elena across the crowded ballroom, then dropped to the boy at her side. The child couldn't have been older than 5, maybe 6. Dark hair swept across his forehead. His small suit was tailored perfectly, a miniature version of the one Riccardo himself wore. But it was those eyes. Those unmistakable gray eyes that stared back at him with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Something that looked far too much like recognition. Elena didn't move. She stood in the archway like a queen surveying her kingdom, the light catching the subtle gold threads woven through her black gown. Her dark brown hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and her hazel eyes held no anger. No tears. Nothing but a calm so absolute it made powerful men take unconscious steps backward. The boy tugged at her hand. "Mama," he whispered loud enough that the nearest guests heard. "Is that him? Is that my papa?" The words landed like grenades. Valeria's champagne glass trembled in her fingers. Her carefully painted smile cracked at the edges. She looked up at Riccardo, waiting for explanation, for denial, for anything. But he gave her nothing. His attention had been stolen completely, captured by the woman he had dismissed and the child he had never known existed. Elena's lips curved into the smallest smile. Not warm. Not cold. Simply knowing. "Perhaps," she said to her son, her voice carrying in the crushing silence, "we should go say hello." She descended the stairs with the grace of someone who had practiced this moment 1,000 times in her mind. Each step deliberate. Each breath measured. The crowd parted before her like the sea before a ship, and not a single person dared to speak. Riccardo felt something foreign crawl up his spine. It took him a moment to recognize it. Fear. He had built his empire on the understanding that he feared nothing. Not rival families. Not federal investigations. Not death itself. He had carved his name into the flesh of this city with his bare hands, worn his power like armor that nothing could penetrate. But watching Elena walk toward him, their child's small hand in hers, he understood with terrible clarity that there were things his power could not touch. Things his money could not buy. Things his name could not erase. She stopped 3 feet away from him. The boy pressed against her leg, those gray eyes examining his father's face with unsettling intensity. "Riccardo." Elena's voice was silk over steel. "I wasn't sure we'd be welcome. After all, you seem to have other plans for the evening." Her gaze flickered to Valeria, and the dismissal in that glance was more devastating than any insult could have been. She looked at the mistress the way one might look at a fly that had landed on expensive food, with mild irritation and the certainty that it would be dealt with shortly. Valeria straightened her spine, attempting to recover her composure. "I don't believe we've met." Irrelevant," Elena finished for her. "I know exactly who you are, Miss Conti. I know where you live, where you work, where you buy your morning coffee. I know the balance of every bank account you've opened since you first caught my husband's wandering eye." She tilted her head, the gesture almost curious. "I know everything. I simply haven't cared enough to do anything about it. Until tonight." The color drained from Valeria's face. Riccardo finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "Elena. We should discuss this privately." "Should we?" She raised an elegant eyebrow. "You didn't seem interested in privacy when you walked through those doors with her on your arm. You didn't seem to care about discretion when you paraded your mistress in front of every powerful family in the country." Her voice never rose, never cracked. It remained perfectly controlled, perfectly calm, perfectly devastating. Why should I offer you a courtesy you've never extended to me? The guests had stopped pretending not to listen. They stood frozen, champagne flutes suspended halfway to lips, conversations abandoned mid-sentence. This was better than any drama they could have orchestrated. The great Ricardo DeSantis, the untouchable king of the underworld, being publicly dismantled by the wife everyone had pitied. The wife everyone had thought was powerless. Marco Benedetti, Ricardo's right-hand man, appeared at his employer's shoulder. His dark eyes were tight with concern, his posture rigid with the understanding that something had shifted fundamentally in the room's power structure. "Boss," he murmured, low enough that only Ricardo could hear. "The Calabrese family is watching. So is Fontana. If this escalates..." "I know." Ricardo's jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. "I know." But he couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't do anything but stare at the small boy who shared his blood, his features, his gray eyes that were currently studying him with the judgment only children could deliver so purely. The boy tugged at Elena's hand again. "Mama, I want to go home. I don't like him. He looks angry." Elena smoothed her son's dark hair with a gentle hand, and the tenderness in that gesture stood in stark contrast to the ice in her voice when she spoke to Ricardo. "Out of the mouths of babes," she said softly. "Children see things so clearly, don't they? They haven't learned to dress cruelty in pretty words or wrap betrayal in excuses." Ricardo's hand shot out before he could stop himself, his fingers closing around Elena's wrist. The crowd gasped. Marco tensed. Somewhere in the room, a glass shattered against the marble floor. "We're leaving." Ricardo's voice was low, dangerous, thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "No. All of us." Elena looked down at his hand on her wrist, at the letters inked across his knuckles. Podera. Power. The word he had lived by. The word that had been his religion, his compass, his excuse for every terrible thing he had ever done. "Remove your hand," she said, "or I will remove it for you." He didn't release her. Instead, his grip tightened fractionally, not enough to hurt but enough to remind her, and everyone watching, that he was still Ricardo DeSantis. That he still commanded armies. That he still held the power of life and death over half the criminal enterprises in the country. Elena's response was to laugh. It wasn't a loud sound, wasn't mocking or harsh. It was soft, almost gentle, and somehow that made it worse. She laughed like someone who had seen the punchline to a joke that everyone else was still trying to understand. "Oh, Ricardo." She shook her head slowly. "You have no idea what's coming, do you? You have no idea what I've been building while you were busy building nothing but monuments to your own ego." Before he could respond, the ballroom doors opened again. This time 4 men entered. They wore suits that cost more than most people's yearly salaries, and they moved with the quiet confidence of people who had nothing to prove. At their head walked a man in his 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, his face carrying the weathered authority of someone who had wielded power longer than Ricardo had been alive. The whispers that swept through the crowd now were not of scandal but of shock. "That's Antonio Varese," someone breathed. "He's supposed to be dead. He's been dead for 7 years. But he wasn't dead. He was very much alive, and he was walking toward his daughter with the measured pace of a man who had been waiting a long time for this moment." "Papa." Elena's voice softened for the first time that night. "Your timing is perfect as always." Antonio Varese stopped beside his daughter, his cold eyes sweeping across Ricardo with the kind of assessment one might give a particularly disappointing insect. Then his gaze dropped to the boy and something shifted in his expression. Something warm and fierce and protective. "My grandson." Antonio's voice was rich with emotion. "You look just like your mother did at your age. The same strength in your eyes." The boy smiled up at him, and in that smile was none of the wariness he had shown Ricardo. No, he said happily. "Mama said you had to stay hidden, but now you don't have to hide anymore. She said the bad time is over." Antonio placed a weathered hand on the boy's head. "Yes, little one. The bad time is over." His eyes rose to meet Ricardo's, and there was no warmth in them now. Only the cold promise of reckoning. "It is very much over." Ricardo felt the floor shifting beneath his feet, though he knew logically that the marble was solid and unchanging. Antonio Varese had been the head of one of the most powerful families in southern Italy before his supposed death. His networks had been legendary. His connections had reached into governments, into banks, into institutions that most criminals couldn't even identify, let alone infiltrate. When word had spread of his death, there had been a war. A brutal, bloody conflict as various factions had tried to claim pieces of his empire. Ricardo himself had emerged from that chaos with significant territorial gains, had built portions of his current power on the rubble of what Antonio Varese had left behind. And now the dead man was standing in front of him, very much alive, while Ricardo's mistress wilted beside him and his wife watched with eyes that saw everything. "I don't understand," Ricardo said slowly, hating how the words sounded like an admission of weakness. "The funeral. The body. I saw photographs. You saw what I wanted you to see." Antonio's voice held no triumph, only fact. "You saw what the world needed to see so that I could rebuild in peace. So that I could protect my daughter from the kind of men who would use her as a pawn in their games of power." His gaze flickered meaningfully to Valeria, who had gone pale as fresh snow. "Men like you, Ricardo DeSantis." Elena stepped forward, placing herself between her father and her husband, though Ricardo noticed with a twist in his gut that she positioned herself closer to Antonio, aligned with him in a way that made loyalties crystal clear. "Perhaps," she said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "we should take this conversation somewhere more private. I believe there are matters to discuss that these lovely people don't need to witness." She gestured elegantly at the frozen crowd, at the shocked faces and gaping mouths, at the phones that had been discreetly raised to capture every moment of the unfolding drama. "Unless," she added, turning back to Ricardo with those calm, knowing eyes, "you'd prefer to continue this here? I have several more revelations that I'm sure your associates would find fascinating. About certain shipments that went missing 3 years ago. About money that was supposed to reach certain families and didn't. About promises made and broken." Ricardo's blood ran cold. He knew. She knew about the Calabrese money. About the weapons he had redirected to his own allies. About the deals he had violated in pursuit of his own expansion. How long had she been watching him? How long had she been gathering evidence while he had dismissed her as decorative and dutiful? How long had he been married to a woman he didn't know at all? "The private salon," he said, his voice stripped of its usual command. "Now." Elena inclined her head in graceful acknowledgement. "After you, husband. I insist." The crowd parted as Ricardo walked through them, and for the first time in his adult life he felt the weight of judging stares rather than respectful fear. He heard the whispers start before he was even out of the main ballroom. Speculation about the child, about the supposedly dead father-in-law, about the wife who had clearly been playing a long game that no one had anticipated. Valeria tried to follow, but a single look from Elena stopped her in her tracks. "You should leave," Elena said, not unkindly. "Not just the gala, the city, perhaps even the country. The things my husband promised you, the protection, the security, the future, those were never his to give. They were mine." He paused, let the words sink in. "And I don't share what's mine with people who have stolen from me." "I didn't," Valeria's voice cracked. "He said you didn't care. He said the marriage was political, that you had an understanding. He said many things." Elena's tone was almost gentle now, which somehow made it worse. Men like Ricardo often do. They convince themselves that their lies are truths, that their betrayals are justified, that the women who love them are too stupid or too weak to see through their beautiful words. She reached out, adjusting a strand of Valeria's artfully tousled hair with a gesture that might have been motherly if it hadn't been so clearly a demonstration of power. "I hope you learn from this, Miss Conti. I hope you find a man who deserves you. A man who doesn't treat his vows like suggestions and his wife like furniture." Then she turned and followed her husband, her father, and her son toward the private salon, leaving Valeria standing alone in the middle of a ballroom full of people who were already crafting the story they would tell for years to come. The night Ricardo DeSantis brought his mistress to the gala. The night his wife destroyed him without raising her voice. The night the dead man walked and the hidden child was revealed. The night everything changed. The private salon was smaller than the ballroom but no less opulent. Crystal decanters lined a mahogany bar. Velvet sofas clustered near a fireplace that crackled with carefully controlled flames. The walls were hung with Renaissance paintings that were almost certainly originals, their gilt frames gleaming in the warm light. Ricardo stood near the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigidly controlled. The crowned eagle tattoo on his neck was visible above his collar, a reminder of the power he had built, the legacy he had carved into his own skin. But in this room, surrounded by people who had clearly been orchestrating events far beyond his understanding, that power felt suddenly fragile. Antonio Varese had settled into one of the velvet chairs, his grandson on his lap. The boy was examining his grandfather's pocket watch, turning it over in small hands, completely unconcerned by the tension that saturated the air. Elena stood by the window, her reflection ghosting against the glass, her dark gown making her appear as though she had been cut from the night itself. Marco had positioned himself near the door, torn between his loyalty to Riccardo and his obvious uncertainty about the shifting dynamics of the room. "His name is Matteo," Elena said without turning from the window. "In case you were wondering." Riccardo's jaw tightened. "I was going to ask. Were you?" She turned then, and the firelight caught her features, highlighting the sharp intelligence in her hazel eyes. "Because in the 5 years since I gave birth to your son, you've never asked about anything that mattered. You've never asked why I stopped accompanying you to social functions. Why I began spending time at my family's old estate in Calabria. Why I stopped seeking your bed." Each word was a small knife, precisely placed. "You told me you were exhausted," Riccardo said slowly, memories rearranging themselves in his mind. "You said you needed rest. Space. Time to recover from losing." He stopped, something cold settling in his chest. "From losing the pregnancy?" Elena finished for him. "The pregnancy you barely acknowledged? The child you seemed relieved to learn hadn't survived." Her voice cracked for the first time, but she controlled it quickly, smoothing her expression back into calm marble. "I didn't lose Matteo, Riccardo. I hid him. I hid him from you because I had seen what you were becoming. What you had already become." The boy looked up at the sound of his name, gray eyes finding his father's face across the room. "Mama says you're sad inside," Matteo announced with the brutal honesty of childhood. "She says that's why you do mean things. Because someone made you sad a long time ago and you never learned how to be happy." Riccardo felt something crack behind his sternum, some wall he had spent decades constructing brick by careful brick. "Your mother," he said roughly, "is very wise." "I know." Matteo returned his attention to the pocket watch, dismissing his father as casually as Riccardo had dismissed so many others over the years. Antonio chuckled softly, the sound warm and cold at once. "He has your arrogance, DeSantis. Perhaps there's hope for him yet, or perhaps that's what we should most fear." He shifted Matteo to the side, rising from his chair with the deliberate movements of someone whose body had learned the price of age but whose mind had lost none of its sharpness. "But we're not here to discuss hope or fear. We're here to discuss the future. Your future. Which, I should note, looks considerably different than it did an hour ago." Riccardo forced his spine to stay straight, his voice to stay level. "You're going to threaten me? In my own territory? With my own wife?" "Threaten?" Antonio seemed genuinely amused. No. Threats are for men who need to establish power. I'm simply going to explain the situation and you're going to listen and then you're going to make a choice. The only choice you have left, really." He walked to the bar, poured himself a measure of amber liquid, and took a contemplative sip before continuing. 7 years ago, I staged my death because I had discovered that several of my most trusted allies were planning to move against me. The war that followed my death was useful. It exposed the traitors. It allowed me to eliminate threats without appearing to lift a finger. And it gave my daughter time. Time for what? Riccardo asked. Time to understand who she had married. Antonio's voice hardened. Time to see past the charm and the promises and the beautiful words. Time to realize that her husband viewed her as nothing more than a strategic acquisition. A path to my networks, my connections, my power. The accusation landed like a blow, not because it was false but because it was true. Riccardo remembered his courtship of Elena, the calculated compliments, the careful attention he had paid to her interests and desires. He had studied her like a rival to be conquered, had identified her weaknesses and strengths with the same precision he applied to business negotiations. He had never considered that she might be doing the same thing to him. The marriage was mutually beneficial, Riccardo said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Your daughter gained protection, status, resources. My daughter gained a husband who began sleeping with other women before their first anniversary. Elena's voice cut through his justifications like a blade through silk. A husband who stopped touching her entirely after the first year, except when he needed to produce an heir. A husband who made her feel invisible in her own home, who talked through her at dinner parties, who couldn't remember her preferences or her hopes or her fears because he had never bothered to learn them in the first place. She moved away from the window, and Ricardo tracked her movement with the awareness of a man who was beginning to realize he had badly miscalculated his enemy. Do you know when I decided to leave you, Ricardo? Not tonight. Not when I discovered Valeria. Not even when I realized you had stopped loving me because you never started. She stood before him now, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, the tiny lines at their corners that spoke of sleepless nights and silent tears. I decided to leave you on our 3rd anniversary. You forgot. You were in Venice with someone whose name I doubt you remember. I sat alone in that enormous dining room with a dinner that had taken hours to prepare, and I waited, and I watched the candles burn down to nothing, and I understood. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. I understood that I was nothing to you. Less than nothing. A piece of furniture that came with the house, a signature on a contract, a body that existed only when you needed something from it. And I decided in that moment that you would never make me feel that way again. The fire cracked. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed midnight. Matteo had fallen asleep in the velvet chair, his small chest rising and falling with the deep breaths of childhood exhaustion. Antonio watched his grandson with the protective vigilance of a wolf guarding its pack. Ricardo looked at his son, truly looked at him for the first time. The way his dark hair curled slightly at his temples. The shape of his nose, which was Elena's. The stubborn set of his jaw, which was undeniably Ricardo's own. 5 years. 5 years of first words and first steps and first everything, and he had missed all of it because he had been too busy building an empire to notice that he had destroyed everything that mattered. What do you want? He asked finally, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Stripped of command. Stripped of arrogance. Stripped of everything except a weariness that went bone deep. You didn't orchestrate all of this just to humiliate me. You could have done that a dozen different ways. So what do you actually want? Elena and her father exchanged a look. A silent communication that spoke of years of planning, of conversations Ricardo had never been privy to, of strategies that had been set in motion long before tonight. I want 3 things, Elena said. First, I want acknowledgement. Public, irrevocable acknowledgement of Matteo as your legitimate heir. I want his name added to every document, every inheritance clause, every succession plan. I want him recognized by every family, every ally, every enemy. I want his position to be unassailable. Ricardo nodded slowly. This was expected. This was reasonable. This was, in fact, something he would have demanded himself if he had known of the boy's existence. Second, I want Valeria Conti gone. Not harmed. I'm not a monster, whatever you might think of me. But gone. I want her relocated somewhere far from here, with enough money to start over, and I want her to understand that if she ever speaks of you or our family again, that relocation will become significantly less comfortable. Unreasonable. Again, something Ricardo would have done eventually, once the novelty of the affair had worn off as it always did. And third, he asked. Elena's chin lifted. Third, I want you to choose. The word hung in the air between them. Choose what? Choose what kind of man you're going to be. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the familiar jasmine of her perfume, close enough that he could see the pulse beating rapidly in her throat despite her outward calm. You can keep being Ricardo DeSantis, the cold king who treats people as pieces on a board. You can keep building your empire of fear and control and hollow victories. You can watch your son grow up from a distance, see him once a year at carefully controlled meetings, hear reports about his progress like he's a business investment. She reached up and her fingers brushed the ink on his neck, the crowned eagle, the symbol of everything he had built. Or, she said softly, you can choose something different. You can choose to be a father, a husband, a man who builds something more lasting than power. Her hand dropped. I'm not asking you to become someone else overnight. I'm not naive enough to think that's possible. But I'm asking you to try. To actually try for once in your life, to be more than what your father made you. The mention of his father was a calculated strike and they both knew it. Ricardo's father had been a brutal man, Efficient, ruthless, utterly without sentiment. He had raised his son with fists and silence, had taught him that love was weakness and vulnerability was death. Every instinct Ricardo had developed, every wall he had built, every cold calculation he had made, they all traced back to a childhood spent learning that the only way to survive was to become something harder and colder than the world around him. But looking at Mateo sleeping peacefully in the velvet chair, Ricardo felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Possibility. The possibility that his son might grow up differently. That the cycle might break. That the kingdom Ricardo had built through fear might be transformed into something built through loyalty and love instead. If I choose differently, he said slowly, testing the words, what happens? You come back. We play happy family for the cameras while you and your father pull the strings behind the scenes. No. Elena shook her head. If you choose differently, we start over. Completely. We rebuild the marriage from the ground up. Honestly this time. With transparency and communication and all the things we've never had. It won't be easy. It won't be quick. And I won't promise that it will work. Her voice wavered slightly. But I'm willing to try if you are. Because despite everything, despite all the ways you've hurt me, I never stopped. She cut herself off, looked away. You never stopped what? Ricardo pressed, stepping closer. Don't. She held up a hand and there were tears in her eyes now, the first real tears he had seen from her in years. Don't ask me to say it when I don't know if you can even hear it. When I don't know if you're capable of understanding what those words would cost me. Antonio rose from his chair, moving with the quiet grace of someone who had witnessed enough emotional moments to know when to intervene. Perhaps, he said mildly, we should allow you both some time to process. It's late. Emotions are running high. And my grandson needs to be put to bed properly, not draped across furniture like a discarded coat. He lifted Mateo gently, cradling the boy against his chest with a tenderness that made Ricardo's heart ache with something he couldn't name. I'll take him to the suite we've arranged, Antonio continued. Elena will stay and continue your discussion. But I want to be clear about one thing, DeSantis. He turned at the door and there was no warmth in his expression now. Only the cold calculation of a man who had survived decades in an unforgiving world. My daughter has given you a gift tonight, the gift of choice. Most men in your position would not receive such mercy. Most men would simply be eliminated, their empires absorbed, their names erased from history. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. If you waste this gift, if you hurt her again, if you fail my grandson, if you prove yourself unworthy of the chance she's offering, I will undo everything you've built. I will turn your allies against you. I will expose every secret, every crime, every betrayal. And when I'm finished, there won't be enough left of Ricardo DeSantis to bury. The threat hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Then Antonio was gone, taking Mateo with him, and Ricardo was alone with his wife for the first time in what felt like years. The fire continued to crackle. The clock continued to tick. And somewhere in the distance, the gala continued without them, 300 people crafting stories about the night the DeSantis empire began to crumble. But in the private salon there was only silence. Elena walked to the bar, poured herself a drink with hands that trembled slightly despite her controlled expression. She drained it in one long swallow, then set the glass down with a click that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. I should go, she said. Mateo will be looking for me when he wakes up. He's not used to sleeping in strange places. Elena. She stopped at the door but didn't turn around. Ricardo crossed the room in 3 strides. His hand closed around her arm, gently this time so different from the grip he had used in the ballroom. When she turned, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and he realized with a start that despite all her strength, despite all her planning, she was still afraid. Afraid of him. Afraid of what he might choose. Afraid of what it would mean if he chose wrong. I don't know how to be what you're asking, he said roughly. I don't know if I'm capable of it. Everything I am, everything I've learned, it's built on being cold. Being hard. Being untouchable. I know. Her voice was barely a whisper. But He stopped, struggled with words that felt foreign in his mouth. I looked at him, at Mateo, and I felt something I don't understand. Something that made me want to burn down everything I've built just to protect him. Elena's breath caught. That's called love, she said softly. That's what it feels like when you love someone more than you love yourself. The word landed like a blow. Love. Such a simple word. Such an impossible concept for a man who had been taught from childhood that love was the ultimate weakness. But watching Elena in the firelight, seeing the hope and fear warring in her beautiful eyes, Ricardo understood something he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He had loved her. Not at first. At first, it had been calculation and strategy and careful manipulation. But somewhere along the way, in quiet moments he had refused to acknowledge, in glances he had pretended meant nothing, in the warmth of her body beside his in the dark hours before dawn, somewhere in all of that love had crept in despite his best efforts to prevent it. And he had been so terrified of that love, so certain that it would destroy him, that he had destroyed it first. He had pushed her away with coldness and neglect. He had filled his bed with other women to prove that she didn't matter. He had built walls so high and so thick that he had convinced even himself that he felt nothing. But the walls had been a lie. The coldness had been a performance. And the other women, Valeria and all the ones before her, they had been nothing but desperate attempts to feel something other than the terrifying warmth that Elena inspired in him. "I'm afraid," he admitted, and the words felt like they were being dragged from somewhere deep inside him. "I'm afraid that if I let myself feel this, it will destroy me. That I'll become weak. That my enemies will see it and use it against me." "Maybe," Elena said. "Or maybe loving something other than power will finally make you strong enough to deserve the empire you've built." She reached up, touched his face with fingertips that were soft and warm against his skin. "I can't make this choice for you, Ricardo. I can only tell you that for the first time in 6 years, I'm willing to believe that you might choose differently. That the man I thought I saw when we first met, the one beneath all the ice and arrogance, that man might actually exist." Her hand dropped. "Think about it. Talk to Marco. Talk to whoever you need to talk to. But when you decide, come find me. Not because your father-in-law threatened you. Not because you want to protect your legacy. Come find me because you want to. Because you're ready to try." She turned toward the door again. "Elena." She paused, her hand on the ornate handle. "I never forgot our anniversary." She went very still. "The third one," he continued, the words coming faster now, as if they had been locked away for so long that they were desperate to finally escape. "I was in Venice, yes. But I wasn't with anyone. I was sitting alone in a hotel room holding a present I had bought you, trying to convince myself to come home. Trying to convince myself that I could be the husband you deserved." He closed his eyes, remembering. "It was a bracelet. Gold with small diamonds. You had mentioned once that your mother had one similar before she died. I spent weeks tracking down a jeweler who could recreate it." Elena's hand dropped from the door handle, but she still didn't turn around. "I sat in that hotel room for hours holding that box, trying to find the courage to come home and give it to you. Trying to find the courage to tell you that He stopped. Started again. "That I felt things I didn't understand. Things that frightened me." "What happened?" Her voice was barely audible. "I convinced myself that you didn't want me there. That I had pushed you away too many times, hurt you too often. I convinced myself that showing up would only make things worse. That my presence would only remind you of everything I had failed to be." He opened his eyes, stared at her back, at the elegant line of her spine beneath black silk. "I threw the bracelet into the canal and told myself I was better off alone." The silence stretched between them like a living thing. Then Elena turned, and her face was wet with tears she no longer tried to hide. "You stupid, broken, impossible man," she whispered. "You absolute fool." She crossed the distance between them in 3 quick strides, and then her hands were fisted in his jacket and she was kissing him, not gently, not carefully, but with all the rage and grief and hope of 6 years of silence. Ricardo's arms came around her automatically, pulling her against him, and for a single perfect moment, there was nothing in the world except this. Except her warmth and her tears and her lips moving desperately against his. Then she pulled back, breathless, her eyes wild. "That doesn't mean I forgive you," she said. "That doesn't mean everything is fine. We still have so much." "I know." He pressed his forehead against hers, felt her breath warm on his face. "I know." They stood there in the firelight, wrapped around each other like survivors of a shipwreck, and Ricardo felt something shift inside him. Some tectonic plate of emotion that had been locked in place for decades finally beginning to move. It hurt. God, it hurt. But beneath the pain there was something else. something that felt almost like hope. The gala had ended hours ago, but the city never truly slept, not the parts that Riccardo ruled anyway. From the windows of the Palazzo Vittoria, he could see the lights of Rome spread out below him like a carpet of stars, each one representing some small piece of his empire. Clubs and restaurants, shipping routes and distribution networks, politicians in his pocket and judges on his payroll. An intricate web of power and influence that had taken 2 decades to build. And yet none of it, he realized with sudden clarity, would mean anything if he lost Elena. If he lost Matteo. Marco appeared at his elbow, a glass of whiskey in hand. "Boss. You've been standing there for an hour." Riccardo took the glass without looking away from the window. "Has it only been an hour?" "Feels longer. The men are talking. Word about tonight spread fast." Marco's voice was carefully neutral. "Some of them are nervous. They're wondering if Antonio Varese's return means a power shift. If old alliances are going to be tested. What do you think?" Marco was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was unusually hesitant. I think I've never seen you scared before, boss. Not in 15 years of watching you stare down every threat this world has thrown at you." He paused. "And tonight in that ballroom you were scared." Riccardo finally turned, meeting his right-hand man's eyes. "Terrified," he corrected softly. "I was terrified." "Of what?" "Varese. He's powerful, but you've faced worse." "Of myself." Riccardo drained his whiskey in one long swallow. "I was terrified of what I had become. Of what I had destroyed without even noticing." He set the empty glass on the windowsill. "Marco, do you remember what I was like when you first started working for me?" Marco's brow furrowed. "Young. Hungry. Determined to prove yourself to the old guard." "I was more than that. I had plans. Dreams even, though I would have died before admitting it." Riccardo's voice was distant, lost in memories. "I used to believe that power was a means to an end. That once I had enough of it I could finally stop fighting and start living. Start building something real. And then I got the power. More power than I ever imagined. And somewhere along the way the means became the end. The power became the point." He laughed bitterly. "I became my father. The very thing I swore I would never be." Marco said nothing, but his expression was thoughtful. "My wife," Riccardo continued, "looked at me tonight like I was a stranger. And she was right. I've been a stranger. Not just to her, to myself. To anything that matters." He turned back to the window. "I have a son, Marco. A 5-year-old boy who looks at me and sees a sad, angry man. A boy who should have known his father from his first breath and instead has spent his whole life learning to fear men like me. What are you going to do?" It was the question that had been echoing in Riccardo's mind since Elena had left the private salon, since he had felt the ghost of her kiss still burning on his lips. What was he going to do? He had spent his entire adult life building an empire designed to protect him from ever feeling vulnerable. Every decision, every alliance, every ruthless maneuver, they had all been in service of the same desperate need to never be hurt again. But Elena had hurt him tonight. Not with threats or weapons or even words, though her words had cut deep enough. She had hurt him by showing him what he could have had. By letting him glimpse for just a moment, a different version of his life. A version where he came home to dinner with his wife and son. Where he read bedtime stories and attended school plays. Where his power served his family instead of consuming them. That glimpse hurt more than any enemy's blade ever could. Because now he knew what he was missing. "I'm going to choose," Riccardo said finally. "For the first time in my life I'm going to choose something other than fear." Before Marco could respond there was a commotion at the door. Raised voices. The sound of someone insisting on entrance despite the late hour and the obvious inappropriateness. The door burst open and Luca Calabrese strode into the room with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. Behind him came 2 bodyguards, their hands hovering near concealed weapons. "DeSantis." Luca's voice was smooth as silk over broken glass. "I heard you had quite an eventful evening." Riccardo didn't react to the intrusion. His posture remained relaxed, his expression bland. But inside, every instinct screamed alert. Luca Calabrese was the head of one of the 3 families that maintained an uneasy alliance with Riccardo's organization. They shared territory along the northern borders. They cooperated on certain shipping routes. and they both pretended not to know about the other's more questionable activities. But Luca was ambitious. Always had been. He had been circling Ricardo's empire like a shark scenting blood for years, waiting for any sign of weakness. And tonight Ricardo had shown weakness in front of 300 witnesses. Luca. Ricardo's voice was even. It's late for social calls. I was in the neighborhood. Luca's smile didn't reach his eyes. And I thought we should discuss what I saw tonight. What everyone saw tonight. He walked to the bar, poured himself a drink without asking permission. A deliberate slight that both men recognized. Your wife, Luca continued, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, made quite an impression. I had no idea she was Antonio Varese's daughter. That information would have been useful, you know. Could have changed the nature of our arrangements considerably. My wife's lineage was never relevant to our arrangements. Wasn't it? Luca turned, and there was something predatory in his expression. A man in your position, ruling an empire, managing countless interests, such a man should have no secrets from his allies. And yet here you've been all these years, sitting on information that could have revolutionized the power structure of our entire organization. Ricardo said nothing. He was reading Luca the way he had learned to read enemies since childhood. Tracking the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tightened on the glass, the barely perceptible shift in his bodyguard's postures. Luca was here to probe, test, to see how weakened Ricardo truly was after the events of the gala. And depending on what he found, he might be here to do more than probe. I also heard, Luca continued, that you have a son, hidden away for 5 years. A legitimate heir that no one knew about. He clicked his tongue disapprovingly. That's the kind of secret that makes people nervous, DeSantis. People start wondering what else you're hiding. What other surprises might be waiting in the shadows. My family matters are my own concern. Are they? Luca stepped closer. Because the way I see it, a man who can't manage his own household, who lets his wife humiliate him in front of every power broker in the country, that man might have difficulty managing more significant responsibilities. That man might need support. Oversight. A stronger partnership than he's previously enjoyed. There was the real reason for this late-night visit. Luca smelled blood in the water and he was making his move. Be very careful, Ricardo said softly, about the implications of your next words. Oh, I'm always careful. Luca's smile widened. That's what's kept me alive this long. I'm simply suggesting that perhaps we should renegotiate certain aspects of our arrangement. Given the changing circumstances. Marco's hand drifted toward his weapon, but Ricardo stopped him with a barely perceptible shake of his head. What circumstances would those be? The circumstances where Antonio Varese, a man with connections that make both of ours look like children playing at business, has apparently been alive and building power for 7 years. The circumstances where that man is now your father-in-law with access to your home, your family, your son. Luca set his glass down with a sharp click. The circumstances where everyone in our world is wondering if Ricardo DeSantis is still the man in charge of Ricardo DeSantis's empire, or if he's about to become a puppet with a dead man pulling his strings. The accusation hung in the air between them. In the old days, even yesterday, Ricardo would have responded to this challenge with overwhelming force. He would have had Luca's bodyguards removed, had Luca himself on his knees, had a gun pressed against the back of his head within seconds of the first disrespectful word leaving his mouth. But tonight, standing in the aftermath of Elena's revelations, something was different. He was tired. Tired of the violence. Tired of the constant vigilance. Tired of being the monster that everyone expected him to be. And more than that, he was afraid of what his son would think if Matteo ever learned the kind of man his father really was. So instead of reaching for violence, Ricardo did something he had never done before. He laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh or a threatening one. It was genuine, surprised, almost delighted, the laugh of a man who had just discovered something absurd and wonderful about the universe. Luca's smile faltered. I appreciate your concern for my marriage, Ricardo said, still chuckling. It's touching, really. And your concern for my relationship with my father-in-law? Practically familial. He stepped closer to Luca, close enough that his height advantage became obvious. But I think perhaps you've misread the situation. Have I? Completely. Ricardo's voice dropped to something intimate, almost friendly. You see, you're operating under the assumption that tonight was a disaster for me. That my wife's little performance damaged my position. He leaned in, his lips nearly brushing Luca's ear. But what if it didn't? What if tonight was the first step in something much larger? What if the return of Antonio Varese wasn't a threat to my power but an expansion of it? He pulled back, watched the doubt bloom in Luca's eyes. Think about it, Luca. Really think. I now have direct family connection to one of the most powerful networks in Southern Europe. I have a legitimate heir whose claim is unassailable. I have a wife who has proven herself capable of the kind of strategic thinking that our enemies should fear. He smiled, and there was nothing warm about it. What exactly about my position has been weakened? Luca's jaw tightened. The public humiliation was a performance. A carefully orchestrated demonstration designed to make people like you show their hands. Ricardo spread his arms wide. And here you are, Luca. 2 hours after the gala, standing in my private quarters, demanding renegotiations. Proving exactly which of my allies would move against me at the first sign of trouble. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Luca's bodyguards exchanged nervous glances. Marco's posture shifted from tension to something almost like amusement. And Luca looked like a man who had just realized he had walked into a trap without ever seeing the jaws close. I wasn't suggesting, he started. Yes, you were. Ricardo's voice was ice now, all traces of that surprising laughter gone. You came here tonight hoping to find me broken and bleeding. You came here hoping to carve off a piece of my empire while I was distracted by family drama. And instead you've revealed yourself. He turned away, dismissal clear in every line of his body. We'll discuss this further tomorrow. After I've had time to consider the implications of your visit. I'm sure there are other members of our alliance who will be very interested to learn how quickly you moved to exploit what you perceived as weakness. Luca's face darkened with anger and fear. DeSantis, I never meant. Leave. The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of decades of accumulated power. Luca hesitated for just a moment, just long enough to consider whether he should push his luck, and then apparently decided that wisdom was the better part of valor. This isn't over, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Ricardo agreed. It isn't. The door closed behind Luca and his bodyguards, and the tension in the room eased fractionally. Marco let out a low whistle. That was different. I've never seen you handle Calabrese without at least threatening to remove one of his fingers. The night's not over yet. He might still lose a finger. Ricardo walked back to the window, staring out at the lights of his city. But not tonight. Tonight, I have more important things to think about. Your wife. Pi family. The word felt strange in his mouth, foreign and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Pi's son. Marco was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was uncharacteristically gentle. You know, boss, I've worked for you for 15 years. I've seen you face down things that would make most men weep. But I've never seen you look the way you did when that little boy walked into the ballroom. He paused. Maybe Calabrese is right about one thing. Maybe everything has changed. Ricardo closed his eyes, remembering Matteo's gray eyes examining him with that mixture of curiosity and wariness. Mama says you're sad inside. Out of the mouths of babes. Yes, he said quietly. Everything has changed. But whether that change would save him or destroy him, that remained to be seen. Elena couldn't sleep. She sat in the suite her father had arranged, watching Matteo's peaceful face in the soft light from the bedside lamp. Her son. Her secret. The piece of Ricardo that she had protected from his father's darkness for 5 long years. Had she done the right thing? The question had haunted her since the moment she made the decision to hide her pregnancy. She had told Ricardo she lost the baby, had watched something flicker and die in his eyes. Something she now understood had been a fragile hope he hadn't known how to express. She had told herself it was for Matteo's protection. That Ricardo would have used their son as a pawn, as a tool, as a means to an end. That the cold, calculating man her husband had become would have damaged their child the way Ricardo's own father had damaged him. But what if she had been wrong? What if, by hiding Matteo, she had denied her son a father who might have changed for him? What if she had denied Ricardo the one thing that could have broken through his walls? What if all these years of pain and loneliness, for both of them, had been unnecessary? You're thinking too loudly. Her father's voice came from the doorway. Antonio walked in, settling into the chair across from her bed with the careful movements of age. Papa. Elena managed a small smile. I thought you'd be sleeping. Sleep is for men without troubles. And my daughter has just set fire to her marriage in front of 500 witnesses. His eyes were gentle despite the sardonic words. I thought perhaps you might want to talk. About what? About whether you regret it. About whether, now that the moment has passed and the adrenaline has faded, you wish you had chosen differently. Elena looked back at Matteo at the peaceful innocence of his sleeping face. I don't know, she admitted. I thought I knew. When I was planning tonight, when I was rehearsing my lines and picking my dress and preparing for the confrontation, I was so certain. So sure that I was doing the right thing. The strong thing. And now I keep seeing his face. When he looked at Matteo for the first time. When I told him about our anniversary. She shook her head slowly. He looked destroyed, Papa. Like everything he believed about himself was crumbling. Good. Antonio's voice was harder now. He needed to see what he was. What he had become. Men like Ricardo DeSantis. They build their lives on foundations of denial. They convince themselves that their cruelty is necessary, that their coldness is strength, that the people they hurt deserved what they got. The only way to reach them is to shatter those illusions completely. But at what cost? At whatever cost is necessary. Antonio leaned forward, taking her hands in his weathered ones. Elena, my darling daughter, I have watched you suffer for 6 years. I have watched you shrink yourself to fit into the space that man allowed you. I have watched you swallow your tears and paste on smiles and pretend that your heart wasn't breaking every single day. His grip tightened. Tonight you stopped pretending. Tonight you stood in front of the most powerful people in the country and you showed them who Elena Varese really is. Not a trophy wife. Not a decorative accessory. A woman of power and intelligence and strength. Is that who I am? Her voice cracked. Because most of the time I feel like a woman who made a terrible mistake when she was too young to know better, and now she's trapped in the consequences of that mistake forever. You are not trapped. That's what tonight was about. Showing you, showing him, showing everyone that you have always had the power to walk away. You simply chose not to use it. Because I loved him. The words escaped before she could stop them. Despite everything. Despite all the ways he hurt me. I loved him. Antonio's expression softened. I know, my darling. And perhaps that's why there might be hope after all. What do you mean? I watched him tonight the way I've been watching him for 7 years. The way I've watched every powerful man I've ever known, looking for weaknesses, for cracks in the armor, for the places where pressure would do the most damage. He released her hands, settling back in his chair. Tonight I saw something I didn't expect. What? Fear. Real, genuine fear. Not of me, though he should certainly fear me, but of himself. Of what he's become. Of what he almost lost. Antonio's voice was thoughtful. I've known many ruthless men in my life, Elena. Most of them are incapable of that kind of self-awareness. They destroy everything around them and never once stop to wonder if perhaps they should have chosen differently. But Ricardo stopped. In that ballroom with every eye on him, he stopped. He could have raged. He could have denied. He could have turned the situation around with violence and intimidation. We both know he has the capacity for it. But instead he surrendered. Elena remembered the moment. Ricardo's hand falling from Valeria's back, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room, the way all the cold confidence drained from his face like water from a cracked vessel. Surrender isn't forgiveness, she said. Surrender isn't change. It's just stopping. True. But stopping is where change begins. Antonio rose, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Sleep, my darling. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. But tonight you should rest. You've earned it. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. Yes, Papa? You asked me once years ago why I didn't simply have Ricardo DeSantis killed. When I first realized how he was treating you. When I saw the light dimming in your eyes with each passing year. Elena nodded slowly. The question had haunted her. The knowledge that her father had the power to end her suffering and had chosen not to use it. I told you then that it was because you didn't want him dead. That you had some romantic notion about redemption that I had to respect, even if I thought it was naive. His voice was soft. That was partly true. But there was another reason. What? I saw the way he looked at you when he thought no one was watching. In unguarded moments when the mask slipped. I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of myself, decades ago. A desperate love locked behind walls of fear and pride. A man who wanted so badly to be worthy of someone precious and didn't know how. Elena felt tears prickling behind her eyes. I stayed my hand, Antonio continued, because I believed that beneath all that ice and armor, there might be a man worth saving. A man who could be the husband you deserved, if only someone forced him to confront what he had become. And now. Antonio smiled slightly. Now we wait. Now we see if I was right or if I sacrificed my daughter's happiness on the altar of a hope that was never more than fantasy. He opened the door. Good night, Elena. Good night, my grandson. And good night to the woman you both helped me become. A woman who believes against all evidence that love might actually be enough. The door closed softly behind him. Elena sat in the quiet room watching her son sleep, feeling the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come pressing down on her like a physical force. Tomorrow she would have to face Ricardo again. Tomorrow she would have to begin the work of rebuilding, or destroying, everything they had been. But tonight, for just a few more hours, she could pretend that the future was still unwritten. That the man she had married might actually become the man she had always hoped he could be. That the love she had never been able to kill, despite her best efforts, might actually have been worth saving. She lay down beside Matteo, careful not to wake him, and let her eyes drift closed. In her dreams, she was standing in a garden she had never seen, surrounded by roses that smelled like home. Ricardo was there, but he was different. Younger somehow, or perhaps just lighter. The weight that he carried in his shoulders, the coldness in his gray eyes, they were gone. He was smiling at her the way he had smiled in the very beginning before everything went wrong. I found my way back, he said in her dream. I found my way back to you. And Elena, dreaming, hoping, still somehow believing, reached out and took his hand. Morning came too quickly. Matteo woke with the sun, bouncing on the bed with the inexhaustible energy of childhood. Mama, where are we? This isn't our room. Are we on an adventure? Elena groaned, dragging herself into consciousness. Yes, Tesoro. We're on an adventure. Is Nano coming on the adventure? Will there be castles? Can we see dragons? No dragons. Elena sat up, pushing her hair out of her face. But maybe castles. And yes, Nano is coming. Matteo launched himself at her in a hug that was more tackle than embrace. I love adventures. Are we going to see that man again? The one from the party? The one you said was my papa? Elena's heart clenched. Maybe. We'll see. He looked sad. Matteo pulled back his gray eyes, Ricardo's eyes, serious beyond his years. Really sad. Like when Francesco's dog died and he cried for a whole week. Yes, Elena said softly. He is sad. Maybe we should bring him on the adventure. Maybe adventures make people happy. Maybe they do. A knock at the door interrupted them. Antonio entered with a tray of breakfast, pastries and fruit and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Good morning, my warriors, he said, setting the tray on the bedside table. I trust you slept well? I dreamed about dragons, Matteo announced. Big ones with gold wings. Did you now? That's excellent. Dragons are very important creatures. They remind us that even the most fearsome things can be beautiful if we look at them the right way. Elena caught her father's eye over Matteo's head. The message was clear. They needed to talk. About what came next. About how to navigate the treacherous waters they had just sailed into. Matteo, she said, why don't you eat your breakfast while Mama and Nano have a grown-up conversation? We'll be just outside the door. Okay. Matteo was already reaching for a pastry. But don't talk too long. Adventures won't wait forever. In the hallway, Elena and her father spoke in low voices. There's been movement, Antonio said. My contacts report that Luca Calabrese visited Ricardo last night, shortly after we left the gala. He was attempting to probe for weakness according to my sources. And Ricardo handled it. Better than I expected, actually. He turned Calabrese's power play against him, left him scrambling to explain his overreach to the other families. Antonio's expression was thoughtful. It seems your husband is not quite as damaged as we assumed. He's not damaged at all. Elena's voice was sharper than she intended. That's what I've been trying to tell you. He's not broken, he's armored. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. She leaned against the wall, exhaustion pulling at her edges. A broken man can't be fixed. But armor can be removed. It just takes the right tools. The right reasons. And you believe you can be those things? The right tools. The right reasons. I believe I have to try. She met her father's eyes. I've spent 6 years telling myself that I was the victim. That Ricardo was the villain. That all I could do was suffer or escape. But last night when I saw his face, when I watched everything he believed about himself crumble, I realized something. What? He's not a villain. He's a tragedy. A man who was broken in childhood and never learned how to heal. A man who buried his capacity for love so deep that he convinced himself it didn't exist. Her voice caught. I've been so angry at him, Papa. So hurt. So desperate to make him understand what he did to me. But I never stopped to ask what had been done to him. Antonio was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was uncharacteristically gentle. You are your mother's daughter, Elena. She had the same irritating tendency to see the best in people, even when they worked very hard to show her their worst. Was she wrong? Not always. She saw the best in me, and that faith, that inexplicable belief that I could be better than I was, it changed me. Made me into someone worthy of her. He sighed. But it also nearly destroyed her. Loving someone who is determined to hurt themselves is exhausting, heartbreaking work. And sometimes, no matter how much faith you have, it isn't enough. I know. Elena straightened, squaring her shoulders. But Matteo deserves to know his father. The real one, not the monster I've painted in my own mind. And Ricardo deserves the chance to know his son. Whatever else he's done, whatever else he becomes, he deserves that much. And if he disappoints you, if he proves himself incapable of change, then I take Matteo and I leave. For good. And I spend the rest of my life building something beautiful out of the wreckage of what we tried to create. She met her father's eyes with a determination that surprised even her. But I have to try, Papa. I have to know that I gave it every chance. Otherwise, I'll spend my whole life wondering. Antonio studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. Then we proceed to the next phase. Which is? You go home. You and Matteo. You return to the house you've been avoiding for 5 years, and you see what your husband does when confronted with the reality of the family he's been missing. And if he can't handle it, if he retreats into coldness, then we'll know. And we'll act accordingly. Antonio's expression hardened. But either way, the waiting is over. The games are finished. From this moment forward, everything is real. Elena nodded, feeling the weight of that truth settle into her bones. After so many years of pretending, of performing, of hiding behind walls of her own construction, finally, mercilessly, devastatingly real. Then let's go home, she said. And hoped with everything she had, that home might still be something worth saving. The drive to the estate took 2 hours. Matteo chattered the entire way, asking questions about every building they passed, every car that overtook them, every bird that flew across their path. His enthusiasm was inexhaustible, and Elena found herself grateful for the distraction. It was easier to focus on her son's joy than on the dread coiling in her stomach. The estate, their estate, though Elena had barely lived there for 5 years, rose from the Tuscan countryside like something from a dream. Ancient stone walls draped in flowering vines. Gardens that had been tended by the same family for 7 generations. A manor house that had witnessed centuries of love and loss, of births and deaths, of empires rising and falling. This was Ricardo's birthplace. The seat of his family's power for longer than anyone could remember. The place where his father had broken him and his mother had failed to save him. This was home. It's big, Matteo breathed as the car wound up the long driveway. It's really, really big. Yes, Tesoro. It is. Do we live here? We used to. And maybe we will again. We'll see. The car stopped before the main entrance. A figure was waiting on the steps, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the same impeccable black suit he always wore. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and there were shadows under his gray eyes that hadn't been there before. Ricardo de Santos looked like a man who hadn't slept. But he also looked like a man who had been waiting for something. Something he had been waiting for his entire life without knowing it. Elena stepped out of the car first, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her she heard Mateo's door open, heard her son's small feet crunching on the gravel drive. Ricardo's eyes went to the boy immediately. The hunger in his gaze was almost painful to witness. A starving man finally seeing food after years of famine. Papa. Mateo's voice was uncertain. Mama, is that my papa? Elena knelt beside her son, smoothing his hair with trembling fingers. Yes, Tesoro. That's your papa. He still looks sad. I know. Mateo studied his father for a long moment, his small face serious. Then before Elena could stop him, he broke away and ran up the steps. Ricardo froze. His entire body went rigid as the child approached, as though he had forgotten how to move. His hands hung at his sides, those tattooed knuckles spelling out potra. Power, but there was no power in his posture now. Only uncertainty. Only fear. Mateo stopped 2 steps below his father, tilting his head back to look up at him. You're tall, the boy announced. Mama said you were tall, but you're really, really tall. Like a giant. Are you a giant? Ricardo's throat moved as he swallowed. No. I'm not a giant. Oh. Mateo seemed to consider this. You look like a giant. A sad giant. I suppose I am sad, Ricardo said slowly. But maybe I won't be anymore. Not now that I've met you. Elena watched from the bottom of the steps, her heart lodged somewhere in her throat. Mateo was studying his father's face with the intensity of a scientist examining a new species. Mama says you forgot how to be happy. She says someone hurt you when you were little and you never learned how to be okay again. Ricardo's eyes flickered to Elena, then back to his son. Your mother is very wise. I know. She's the smartest person in the world. Mateo reached up, his small hand hovering uncertainly near Ricardo's sleeve. When I'm sad, Mama gives me hugs. They help. Do you want a hug? The question hung in the air like something fragile and precious. Ricardo DeSantis, the feared Mafia king, the man who had made empires tremble and enemies weep, dropped to his knees on the cold stone steps and opened his arms. Mateo stepped into them without hesitation. Elena watched her husband wrap his arms around their son, watched his face crumple with an emotion that was too big for his carefully constructed walls to contain. She saw tears, actual tears, tracking down his cheeks, disappearing into Mateo's dark hair. I'm sorry, Ricardo was whispering. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't. It's okay. Mateo's small hand patted his father's back with the unconscious wisdom of children. Mama says it's okay to be sad. And it's okay to cry. And it's okay to make mistakes as long as you try to do better. Ricardo pulled back, his hands cupping his son's face, drinking in every detail as though memorizing a map to salvation. I will try, he said hoarsely. I will try to do better. I promise. Good. Mateo beamed up at him. Because I always wanted a papa and now I have one and I don't want you to be sad anymore. Being sad is boring. I want to have adventures. Do you like adventures? A laugh escaped Ricardo. A broken, wet, disbelieving laugh. I haven't had an adventure in a very long time. Then we'll have lots of them. Mama and me and Nano and you. We'll have so many adventures that you'll forget how to be sad. That's what Mama says anyway. She says happiness is a choice you have to make every day. Ricardo looked up at Elena, who had finally climbed the steps to stand beside them. Is that what she says? Yes. Elena's voice was steadier than she felt. That's what she says. He rose slowly, never breaking eye contact with her. Mateo had already darted past them, drawn by a butterfly in the nearby garden, his attention shifting with the mercurial speed of childhood. Elena. Ricardo's voice was raw. Last night. Everything you said. Everything your father said. I've been thinking about it all night. About what it means. About what I've done. And I don't know how to be the man you described. The father. The husband. I don't know if I'm capable of it. He reached up, his fingers hovering near her face without quite touching. But I want to try. If you'll let me. If you'll teach me. Elena caught his hand, pressing it against her cheek. I can't teach you how to love, Ricardo. That's something you have to find within yourself. Then help me find it. His voice cracked. Please. I know I don't deserve it. I know I've done nothing to earn your patience or your faith. But I'm asking anyway. Because I don't know what else to do. Because looking at that boy, our boy, I feel something I've never felt before. Something that makes me want to be better. Something that makes me believe I can be. Elena was silent for a long moment, watching emotions flicker across her husband's face. Hope, fear, desperation, love. All the things he had spent a lifetime denying. All the things that were finally, devastatingly visible. We start slow, she said finally. We rebuild from the ground up. And the first time you retreat into coldness, the first time you choose power over family, I leave. For good. No more chances. No more waiting. I understand. Do you? She stepped closer, close enough that she could see the individual flecks of silver in his gray eyes. Because this isn't a negotiation, Ricardo. This isn't a deal where we both make concessions and meet in the middle. This is you changing. Fundamentally. Becoming someone capable of love and warmth and vulnerability. And if you can't do that, if you won't, then everything else is meaningless. I know. Say it. Say you understand what I'm asking of you. He took her hands in his, those tattooed knuckles wrapping around her fingers with a gentleness that somehow felt more powerful than any display of dominance. You're asking me to become the man I've been running from my entire life. The man my father taught me was weak. The man I was so terrified of being that I became a monster instead. Elena nodded slowly. I understand, Ricardo said. And I choose you. I choose Matteo. I choose whatever version of myself I have to become to deserve you. He raised her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles that felt more like a vow than any words could have been. I choose us, he whispered. For however long you'll let me. For however long I have. In the garden, Matteo shrieked with delight as he finally caught the butterfly he had been chasing. The sound floated across the morning air like a benediction, like a promise, like the first note of a song that had been waiting years to be sung. Elena looked at her husband, at the hope and fear warring in his beautiful, damaged eyes. And against every instinct that screamed for caution, she believed him. If this story moved you, please consider how far we've come together through these words. Like, share, and subscribe for the continuation, where choices will be tested, love will be challenged, and we'll discover whether redemption is truly possible for a man who spent his whole life learning to be cold. Please like, share, and subscribe. The first weeks were fragile things, delicate as spun glass. Elena watched her husband navigate fatherhood with the uncertainty of a man learning to walk on unstable ground. Ricardo would stand in doorways watching Matteo play, his expression caught somewhere between wonder and terror. He would reach out to touch his son's hair, then pull back at the last moment as though afraid his hands might break something precious. But slowly, inch by inch, he began to learn. He started with small things. Sitting beside Matteo during meals instead of at the opposite end of the long dining table. Asking questions about the boy's day, his interests, his dreams. Learning the names of Matteo's imaginary friends. Captain Storm, Princess Luna, and a dragon named Roberto who lived in the garden and only ate vegetables. Roberto is very specific about his diet, Matteo explained seriously one evening at dinner. He says meat makes his fire too hot, and then he burns things he doesn't mean to burn. Ricardo nodded with equal seriousness. That sounds like a wise dragon. Self-control is important. That's what Mama says too. She says everyone has fire inside them and the trick is learning when to let it out and when to keep it in. Gray eyes met Hazel across the table. Elena felt something warm bloom in her chest at the look Ricardo gave her, grateful, almost reverent. Your mother, he said quietly, is the wisest person I've ever known. Matteo beamed. I know. I told you. Smartest person in the world. After dinner, when Matteo had been read 3 stories, negotiated a 4th and finally surrendered to sleep, Ricardo found Elena in the library. She was curled in her favorite chair by the window, a book open in her lap but her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. He's extraordinary, Ricardo said, settling into the chair across from her. I don't know how you did it. Raising him alone. Keeping him hidden. Teaching him to be so good. He taught me more than I taught him. Elena closed her book, setting it aside. Children have a way of doing that. They see the world so clearly. They haven't learned to complicate everything the way adults do. He called me a sad giant. You are a sad giant. Or you were. She tilted her head, studying him. You seem less sad now. I feel less sad. Ricardo leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I don't have words for it, Terrified mostly. That I'll do something wrong. That I'll damage him the way my father damaged me. That one day he'll look at me with fear instead of curiosity. That's not going to happen. You don't know that. I know you. Elena's voice was soft but certain. I've watched you for 6 years, Ricardo. I've seen the man you pretend to be and the man you actually are. They're not the same person. The pretender is cold and cruel and calculating. But the real you, the one you've spent your whole life hiding, that man is capable of great love. He just never believed he deserved it. Ricardo was quiet for a long moment. My father used to say that love was a cage, he finally said. That anyone who let themselves feel it was giving their enemies a weapon. He said the only way to be truly powerful was to need no one, want nothing, feel nothing. His voice dropped. He said it while he was breaking my fingers because I had cried at my mother's funeral. Elena's breath caught. I was 8, Ricardo continued, his eyes distant. 8 years old, standing beside my mother's grave, trying to be strong because he had told me strength was everything. But I couldn't stop the tears. I loved her so much, you see. She was the only warmth in that entire cold house. And when she was gone... He shook his head slowly. He waited until we were home. Until the guests had left. Then he sat me down in his study and explained very calmly that my display at the cemetery had been unacceptable. That tears were weakness. That weakness was death. Ricardo. He broke 3 of my fingers. 1 for each tear he had counted on my face. Then he left me there alone and told me to think about what I had learned. Ricardo's voice was flat, emotionless. The voice of a man describing something that had happened to someone else. I didn't cry again for 25 years. Not until last night. Not until I held my son for the first time. Elena rose from her chair, crossing the distance between them. She knelt before him, taking his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Listen to me, she said fiercely. What your father did to you, what he taught you, that was not strength. That was cruelty wearing the mask of wisdom. And the fact that you survived it, that you found your way to this moment, that you can hold your son and let yourself feel. That is strength. Real strength. The kind your father never had. Tears were sliding down Ricardo's cheeks again and he made no move to hide them. I don't know how to be different, he whispered. I've been him for so long. Controlled. Calculating. I don't know how to be anything else. Then we learned together. Elena pressed her forehead against his. Day by day. Moment by moment. We build something new out of the wreckage of what we were. And every time you slip, every time the old patterns try to take hold, I'll be here. Matteo will be here. Reminding you of who you're choosing to become. His hands came up, covering hers where they rested on his face. I don't deserve you. Maybe not. But you have me anyway. She pulled back slightly, meeting his eyes. The question is whether you're brave enough to keep me. Brave enough. Love takes courage, Ricardo. More courage than violence ever could. It means opening yourself to pain, to loss, to the possibility that the person you love might hurt you or leave you or die. It means choosing vulnerability in a world that punishes the vulnerable. She smiled slightly. It means risking everything you've built for something you can't control. You make it sound terrifying. It is terrifying. But it's also the only thing that makes life worth living. She rose, extending her hand to him. Come to bed. Not for anything except sleep. But come and lie beside me and let me hold you while you rest. Let me show you what it feels like to not be alone. Ricardo stared at her hand for a long moment. Then slowly he took it. The days stretched into weeks. The weeks became a month. Elena watched her husband transform bit by bit, like a statue gradually warming into flesh. He still had moments of coldness, instants where the old Ricardo would surface, his jaw hardening, his eyes going flat and dead. But they were becoming less frequent. And each time it happened she saw him catch himself, saw him consciously choose a different path. Matteo was the key. The boy had no patience for his father's darkness, no tolerance for emotional distance. He would climb into Ricardo's lap uninvited, demand stories and games and attention with the cheerful insistence of childhood. He would call out his father's moods with devastating accuracy. You're doing the sad thing again, Matteo announced one afternoon when Ricardo's expression had shuddered during a business call. Your face went all hard and scary. I don't like the scary face. Ricardo had ended the call mid-sentence, set down his phone and pulled his son into a hug. "I'm sorry," he said into Matteo's hair. "I'll try to keep the scary face away." "Good. Because Roberto doesn't like it either, and when Roberto gets upset he accidentally sets the vegetables on fire, and then he's sad because he has nothing to eat. We can't have a hungry dragon." "No," Matteo agreed solemnly. "Hungry dragons are the worst kind." Elena found herself falling in love with her husband again, or perhaps for the first time with the real version of him instead of the mask he had worn during their courtship. This Ricardo laughed at their son's jokes. This Ricardo remembered her favorite tea and brought it to her without being asked. This Ricardo sat beside her in the evenings, reading in companionable silence, occasionally reaching over to touch her hand as though reminding himself she was real. But the outside world had not forgotten them. Antonio came to visit in the 5th week, his expression grave. "We have a problem," he said once Matteo was safely occupied with his nanny in the garden. "Luca Calabrese has been busy." They gathered in Ricardo's study. Elena, her father, Ricardo and Marco, who had become a permanent fixture in the household since the gala. "What kind of busy?" Ricardo asked, his voice carefully controlled. "The kind that involves meeting with your other allies. The Fontana family. The Corsetti brothers. Even some of the smaller operations in Milan." Antonio spread his hands. "He's telling them what he saw at the gala. Spinning it as evidence of your weakness. Suggesting that your priorities have shifted, that you're no longer focused on business. And they're listening? Some of them. The ones who have always resented your dominance. The ones who think they could do better if only they had the chance." Antonio's expression was grim. Calabrese is positioning himself as the alternative. The steady hand that will take over when the great Ricardo de Santis finally cracks under the weight of his domestic troubles. Elena watched her husband's face, waiting for the coldness to return. Waiting for the hardening of his jaw, the flattening of his eyes, the emergence of the ruthless king who had ruled through fear. But Ricardo only nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than threatening. "What do you suggest?" he asked Antonio. The older man's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're asking me for advice? You have more experience than I do. Different experience. And you've been watching this situation develop from the outside, which gives you perspective I lack." Ricardo met Antonio's eyes steadily. "I'm learning that asking for help isn't weakness. It's wisdom. Something I should have understood a long time ago." Antonio was silent for a moment, then smiled. A genuine smile, warm with something that might have been respect. "My daughter chose better than I gave her credit for," he said quietly. Then straightening, "Very well. Here's what I think you should do." The plan Antonio outlined was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than confronting Calabrese directly, which would play into the narrative of Ricardo as volatile and unstable, they would undermine him through misdirection and strategic reveals. "We use the truth as a weapon," Antonio explained. "The truth about your marriage, about Matteo, about your new priorities. We spin it as strength rather than weakness. Show the other families that you're building something lasting, something that will outlive any individual business arrangement." "How?" "A gathering. Here at the estate. We invite everyone, allies, rivals, the undecided. We show them Matteo. We show them Elena at your side. We demonstrate that your household is united, your position secure, your legacy assured." Antonio leaned back. "Men like Calabrese rely on the perception of instability. Remove that perception and his entire strategy collapses." Ricardo considered this. "It's risky. Inviting everyone here. Exposing Matteo to people who might see him as leverage. Everything is risky. The question is whether the risk is worth the reward." Antonio's eyes flickered to Elena. "And whether you trust the people around you to help you manage that risk." "I trust them," Ricardo said quietly. "For the first time in my life, I trust the people in this room without reservation." Elena felt something catch in her chest. She reached for his hand and he took it without hesitation, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Then we proceed," Antonio said. "We send the invitations. We prepare the stage. And in 2 weeks, we show the world what the De Santis family has become." The preparations consumed the next 14 days. Elena threw herself into the work with a focus that surprised even her. She coordinated with the household staff, planned menus, arranged security, managed guest lists. It was exhausting, all-consuming work, but it kept her mind occupied and her fears at bay. Because beneath her calm exterior she was terrified. Not of Calabrese or the other families. Not of the political maneuvering or the strategic revelations. She was terrified that when the moment came, when Ricardo was surrounded by the men who had known him as cold and ruthless and untouchable, he would slip back into the mask. That the man she had been falling in love with would disappear, replaced by the king who had broken her heart so many times. She voiced these fears to him the night before the gathering, lying beside him in the darkness of their bedroom. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "I'm scared of who you might become tomorrow." Ricardo pulled her closer, his arm wrapping around her waist. "I'm scared too," he said against her hair. "I'm scared I'll fail you. That I'll revert to what I was because it's easier, because it's familiar, because the old patterns are so deeply ingrained that I won't be able to resist them. Then how do we do this? Together." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Every time I feel myself slipping, I'll look for you. Your eyes, your face, your presence. You remind me of who I want to be. When I see you, I remember why I'm trying." That's a lot of pressure to put on one person. It's not pressure. It's purpose. He shifted, rising on his elbow to look down at her in the dim light. "You and Matteo, you're not weights dragging me down. You're anchors holding me steady. There's a difference." Elena reached up, tracing the line of his jaw, the stubble rough beneath her fingertips. "I love you," she said. "I don't know if I've said it since everything changed. But I do. I love you. The real you. The one who cries when he hugs his son and brings me tea without being asked and laughs at terrible jokes." Ricardo's eyes glistened in the faint moonlight. "I love you too," he whispered. "I think I always have. I was just too afraid to admit it. Too convinced that love was a trap, a weapon someone would use against me." He lowered his head, his forehead touching hers. "But you've shown me that love is the only thing that matters. The only thing worth fighting for. The only thing worth becoming better for." Their lips met, soft, tender, nothing like the desperate collision of the night after the gala. This was something deeper, something more lasting. A promise sealed in breath and warmth and the quiet darkness of their shared bed. When they finally pulled apart, Elena found herself smiling. "We're going to be okay," she said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we're going to be okay." "Yes," Ricardo agreed. "We are." And for the first time in 6 years she truly believed it. The day of the gathering dawned bright and clear. The estate had been transformed. Gardens groomed to perfection. Fountains sparkling in the sunlight. Staff moving with practiced efficiency, ensuring every detail was precisely as Elena had specified. Guests began arriving in the early afternoon, sleek cars winding up the long driveway, disgorging men and women in impeccable attire. Elena greeted each arrival with a smile that revealed nothing of her inner turmoil, while Ricardo stood at her side, his hand a constant warm presence at the small of her back. Luca Calabrese arrived late, which Elena recognized as a deliberate power play. He emerged from his car with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, his posture radiating a confidence that seemed slightly forced. "DeSantis," he said, extending his hand. "Lovely estate. I don't believe I've ever been invited before. An oversight I'm correcting." Ricardo's handshake was firm but not aggressive. "Welcome to our home." Luca's gaze shifted to Elena, and there was something calculating in his assessment. "Mrs. DeSantis, you're looking well. I trust the domestic situation has stabilized since we last met." "The domestic situation was never unstable," Elena replied smoothly. "But I appreciate your concern." Before Luca could respond, a small figure came hurtling across the lawn. "Mama. Papa." Matteo skidded to a halt beside them, his formal clothes already slightly askew. "Roberto says there's a man in the garden who smells like bad things, and I should stay away from him." Elena caught Luca's face tightening at the mention of the imaginary dragon, and at the casual way Matteo addressed Ricardo as Papa. "Thank you for telling us," Ricardo said, crouching to meet his son's eyes. "Which man?" "That one." Matteo pointed directly at Luca. "Roberto says he has a hungry look like the wolves in my storybook. The ones who pretend to be nice but really want to eat all the sheep." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. Beside her, she could feel Ricardo's shoulders shaking with suppressed amusement. "Roberto sounds like a wise dragon," Ricardo said gravely. We should always listen to wise dragons. I know. That's what I said. Matteo turned to study Luca with those gray eyes, Ricardo's eyes, that seemed to see straight through pretense. Are you a wolf, mister? Because I don't like wolves. They're sneaky. I assure you, Luca said through gritted teeth, I am not a wolf. Matteo didn't seem convinced. That's what a wolf would say. He turned back to his parents. Anyway, I'm going to go play with Captain Storm now. He wants to defeat the evil pirates. He ran off without another word, leaving Luca standing in his wake, his composure visibly rattled. Children, Elena said pleasantly. They say the most interesting things. Indeed. Luca's smile was strained. You must be very proud. We are, Ricardo said. More proud than I can express. He gestured toward the main terrace where other guests were gathering. Shall we? I believe my father-in-law has some announcements he'd like to make. They walked as a group toward the gathering, Elena and Ricardo side by side, Luca trailing behind them like a wolf who had suddenly realized he had wandered into a lion's den. Antonio's speech was masterful. He stood before the assembled guests, 30 of the most powerful figures in the criminal underworld, and spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had nothing to prove. 7 years ago, he began, I made a decision that many of you believed was the end of my story. I stepped back from the life I had built, allowed the world to think I was dead, and watched from the shadows as you all scrambled to claim pieces of what I had left behind. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I did this for many reasons, but the primary one was simple. I was tired. Tired of the violence. Tired of the paranoia. Tired of watching men destroy themselves and everyone around them in pursuit of power they couldn't keep. His eyes swept the assembled faces. I wanted something different for my daughter. Something better. Elena felt Ricardo's hand tighten on hers. Instead, Antonio continued, she found herself married to a man who embodied everything I had hoped to protect her from. A man who was cold where she needed warmth, distant where she needed presence, calculating where she needed love. Ricardo's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. He stood tall, accepting the condemnation. I could have intervened. I could have removed him from the equation permanently. Many of you know I have the capability. Antonio's voice hardened. But my daughter asked me to wait. She believed, against all evidence, that the man she had married was capable of becoming someone worthy of her love. He paused, letting the words settle. I thought she was naive. I thought she was blinded by sentiment, unable to see clearly because her heart was involved. A slight smile crossed his weathered face. I was wrong. The murmurs intensified. Over the past several weeks I have watched Ricardo DeSantis transform. I have watched him become a father to the son he didn't know he had. I have watched him become a husband, a true husband, to the wife he had neglected for years. I have watched him choose vulnerability over coldness, love over fear, family over power. Antonio's gaze found Luca Calabrese in the crowd. There are those among you who believe this transformation is weakness, who see a man focused on his family and assume he has lost his edge, his ambition, his capacity for decisive action. His voice dropped to something almost dangerous. Those people are mistaken. He gestured, and Elena watched as Marco and several other men moved through the crowd, handing out folders to each guest. Inside those folders, Antonio continued, you will find documentation of every meeting Luca Calabrese has held over the past month. Every conversation he has had attempting to undermine the DeSantis family. Every promise he has made to your rivals about territories and arrangements that he has no right to offer. Luca's face went white. You will also find evidence of his family's involvement in activities that violate our most sacred agreements. Trafficking. Of people, not goods. Activities that we have all agreed cross lines that should never be crossed. The silence in the garden was absolute. Ricardo DeSantis has changed, Antonio said. He has become a better man, a better husband, a better father. But do not mistake his gentleness for weakness. Do not assume that his love for his family has diminished his capacity to protect them. His eyes swept the crowd one final time. Because behind every great man stands a family willing to defend him. And behind this family stands me. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Luca tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but no words emerged. Around him, the other guests were leafing through their folders, expressions ranging from shock to disgust to calculation. "I believe," Ricardo said, stepping forward to stand beside his father-in-law, "that Mr. Calabrese was just leaving. Unless anyone objects." No one objected. Luca stumbled backward, his composure completely shattered. He cast one final venomous look at Ricardo and Elena, then turned and fled toward his car. As the sound of his engine faded into the distance, Ricardo turned to address the remaining guests. "My father-in-law has said everything that needed to be said. But I want to add one thing." His voice carried across the garden, steady and clear. "For years I ruled through fear. I believed that was the only way to maintain power, to protect my interests, to ensure my survival. I was wrong." He reached for Elena's hand, pulling her to stand beside him. "This woman, my wife, taught me that there is strength in love. That vulnerability does not equal weakness. That the most powerful thing a man can do is admit he was wrong and choose to be better." He raised their joined hands. "I choose to be better. Every day. For her. For our son. For the future I want to build instead of the past I was repeating." His eyes swept the assembled guests. "If any of you have concerns about my leadership, about my commitment, about my capacity to protect your interests, speak now. I am happy to discuss them. But know this. The man who stood before you a month ago, the cold king who feared nothing and felt less, that man is gone. In his place stands a husband, a father, and a leader who understands that true power comes not from what you're willing to destroy, but from what you're willing to protect." For a long moment no one spoke. Then slowly Giorgio Fontana, the patriarch of one of the oldest families, began to clap. Others joined him. Within seconds the entire gathering was applauding, and Elena watched as decades of cold calculation melted into something that looked almost like respect. Almost like admiration. Ricardo turned to her, his eyes bright with emotion. "We did it," he whispered. "We did it," she agreed. And then Matteo came barreling through the crowd, throwing himself at his parents with the exuberance of a child who had no idea what had just transpired and didn't care. "Roberto says the wolves are gone," he announced triumphantly. "He scared them away with his fire." Ricardo laughed, sweeping his son into his arms. "Roberto is a hero. I know. He's the best dragon in the whole world." Matteo wrapped his arms around his father's neck, then leaned over to include Elena in the embrace. "And you're the best mama and papa in the whole world. Can we have cake now?" "Yes, tesoro," Elena said, her eyes blurring with happy tears. "We can have cake now." The weeks that followed were the happiest of Elena's life. With Calabrese's influence shattered and the other families firmly aligned behind Ricardo, the external pressures that had shadowed their household finally eased. There was still work to be done. There would always be work to be done. But for the first time Elena felt like they had room to breathe. Room to grow. Room to become the family they had never had the chance to be. Ricardo threw himself into fatherhood with the intensity he had once reserved for business. He learned Matteo's schedule, his preferences, his fears, and his dreams. He attended every meal, every bedtime story, every imaginary adventure with Captain Storm and Princess Luna and the vegetable-eating dragon Roberto. He also learned Elena. Really learned her in ways he had never bothered to before. He learned that she hated mornings but loved the way light looked through the library windows at dawn. He learned that she had wanted to be a painter before her father's world had claimed her, and he quietly arranged for an art studio to be built in the east wing of the estate. He learned that she sometimes cried at night, still processing years of loneliness and pain, and he learned to hold her through those moments without trying to fix them. "You can't fix everything," she told him one night, when he looked helpless in the face of her tears. "Sometimes people just need to feel. They need to let the pain out so it doesn't fester." "I want to take it away," he said, his voice rough. "I want to undo every moment that hurt you. You can't. But you can be here while I heal. That's enough." So he was there. Night after night. A steady presence in the darkness, anchoring her to something real. And slowly, incrementally, the wounds began to close. 3 months after the gala, Elena found herself standing in the art studio Ricardo had built for her, staring at a blank canvas. She hadn't painted in 7 years. Had convinced herself she had lost the ability, the desire, the spark that had once made colors sing beneath her brush. But now, with the morning light streaming through the windows and the smell of fresh paint filling her lungs, she felt something stirring. Something awakening. She picked up a brush. Mixed colors on her palette. And then, without consciously deciding to, she began to paint. The image that emerged was not planned. It flowed from somewhere deep inside her. A garden of roses in full bloom, their petals rendered in shades of red that ranged from blood dark to sunset pale. In the center of the garden stood 3 figures. A tall man in black, a woman in white, and a small boy reaching up to catch a butterfly. She was still painting when Ricardo found her hours later, the light outside having shifted from morning gold to afternoon amber. Elena. His voice was soft with wonder. This is extraordinary. He stepped back, really looking at the canvas for the first time. The family in the garden. The roses that surrounded them. The butterfly that the boy was reaching for, forever suspended in mid-flight. It's us, she said. Or who I hope we're becoming. Ricardo moved to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. We are becoming this, he said. Day by day. Just like you said. Do you really believe that? I believed that 6 months ago. I didn't know I had a son. I believed my wife was a stranger who shared my house but not my life. I believed that power was the only thing that mattered and love was a weakness that would destroy me. He pressed a kiss to her neck, just below her ear. Now I know that everything I believed was wrong. And for the first time in my life, I'm grateful to be wrong. Elena turned in his arms, facing him. There's something I need to tell you, she said. Something flickered in his eyes. The old fear, the instinctive bracing for bad news. But he controlled it, kept his voice steady. What is it? I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them. Ricardo's face went through a series of expressions. Shock, disbelief, wonder, and finally joy. Pure, unfiltered joy that transformed his features into something she had never seen before. Pregnant, he repeated. We're going to have another baby. Yes. She bit her lip, suddenly uncertain. I know we haven't talked about it. I know things are still complicated. If you're not ready. He kissed her before she could finish the sentence. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce and desperate and filled with everything he couldn't put into words. His hands cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. Ready? He said when they finally broke apart. I've been waiting my whole life for this without knowing it. A family. A real family. Children who will grow up knowing they are loved. Who will never wonder if their father sees them as anything other than the most precious things in the world. This baby will know, Elena whispered. Just like Mateo knows. Just like I know now. I love you. The words came easily now without the struggle they had once required. I love you and Mateo and this baby and the life we're building together. I love all of it with a ferocity that terrifies me. But I'm not afraid of being terrified anymore. He rested his forehead against hers. I'm not afraid of anything as long as I have you. You have me, she promised. For the rest of our lives. For every moment that comes after. You have me. They stood there in the studio wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the smell of paint and possibility. The canvas behind them captured a moment of hope frozen in color. The future stretched before them like an uncharted map, full of challenges and triumphs they couldn't yet imagine. But whatever came, they would face it together. As a family. 6 months later, in the same bedroom where Mateo had been born in secret and sorrow, Elena gave birth to a daughter. They named her Sofia, after Ricardo's mother. The woman who had been the only light in his dark childhood, whose loss had shattered something in him that was only now beginning to heal. She has your eyes, Ricardo said, cradling his daughter for the first time. His voice was thick with emotion, his gray eyes bright with tears he no longer tried to hide. Hazel. Like honey in sunlight. And your stubbornness, Elena said, exhausted but radiant. She's been fighting me for 9 months. I suspect she'll be fighting you for the rest of her life. Good. I want my children to fight. To push back. To never accept cruelty as normal or coldness as strength. He looked down at the tiny face, at the rosebud mouth and the delicate fingers that were already wrapping around his thumb. She will never know the childhood I had. None of our children will. I swear it. Papa. Mateo came bursting through the door, Antonio following at a more dignified pace. Is she here? Is my sister here? She's here, Ricardo said, kneeling so Matteo could see. Come say hello to Sofia. Matteo peered at the baby with the critical eye of a 6-year-old brother. She's really small. She'll grow. Does she know about Roberto? Does she know about Captain Storm and Princess Luna? Not yet. But you can tell her all about them. Matteo's face lit up. I'll tell her everything. And when she's bigger she can come on adventures with us. Can she, Papa? Can she come on adventures? She can come on every adventure, Ricardo promised. We all can. Together. Antonio stood in the doorway, watching the scene with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. When his eyes met hers, she saw something that might have been pride. Something that was definitely love. You did well, my daughter, he said quietly. You saw what I couldn't see. You believed what I refused to believe. And now look at what you've built. Elena smiled, reaching for his hand. We built it together, Papa. All of us. Even you. Even me. He squeezed her fingers. Though I'll maintain to my grave that I was prepared to kill him if he disappointed you. I know. I think he knows too. Good. Healthy motivation for a son-in-law. Ricardo looked up, and for a moment the two men regarded each other across the room. Once not so long ago they had been adversaries, circling each other like wolves, each waiting for the other to show weakness. Now something different passed between them. Respect perhaps. Or understanding. Or simply the recognition that they both loved the same woman, the same children, the same family that had become the center of all their worlds. Thank you, Ricardo said quietly, for not killing me when you had the chance. Antonio's lips twitched. Thank my daughter. She has better judgment than I do. I do, Elena agreed. And I always will. The years that followed were not perfect. There were still challenges, business conflicts that required resolution, rivals who tested their defenses, moments when the old wounds threatened to reopen. Ricardo still struggled sometimes with the patterns his father had carved into him. Elena still cried sometimes, processing grief that went back decades. But they faced everything together. When Matteo started school and came home crying because other children had called his family dangerous, Ricardo sat with him for hours, explaining in age-appropriate terms that sometimes people fear what they don't understand. When Sofia proved to have inherited her grandfather's strategic mind and began orchestrating elaborate schemes at the age of 3, Elena taught her how to channel that brilliance into creativity instead of manipulation. When Ricardo's old enemies made one final attempt to destabilize the family, a kidnapping plot that never came to fruition thanks to Antonio's intelligence network, the response was swift and decisive. But it was Elena who designed the strategy, Elena who coordinated the countermeasures, Elena who ensured that justice was served without unnecessary bloodshed. She had become, without anyone quite realizing it, the true power behind the DeSantis throne. And Ricardo, rather than resenting her rise, celebrated it, supported it, made it clear to everyone who mattered that his wife was his equal partner in everything, including the parts of his empire he had once considered solely masculine territory. You've changed him, Marco observed one evening years after the gala that had started everything. He and Elena were standing on the terrace, watching Ricardo chase their children through the gardens below. I've known him for 20 years. I've seen him at his worst and what I thought was his best. But I never imagined he could become this. I didn't change him, Elena said. I gave him permission to change himself. There's a difference. An enormous one. Change that's forced from outside never lasts. It's brittle, fragile, easily reversed when the pressure eases. But change that comes from within, from a genuine desire to be better, that's transformation. That's permanent. Marco was quiet for a moment. Then, you're not just talking about him, are you? Elena smiled, watching her husband sweep Sofia into his arms while Matteo hung from his back like a climbing monkey. I changed too, she admitted. I was so focused on being a victim, on cataloging every way he had hurt me, that I forgot I had the power to write a different story. I could have left. I could have destroyed him. Instead, I chose to give him a chance, and in doing so I gave myself one too. You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. DeSantis. I know, she said, and there was no arrogance in it. Only truth. But so is every woman who refuses to accept that her story has to end in tragedy. Every woman who fights for something better, even when the world tells her it's impossible. Below them, Ricardo looked up. Their eyes met across the distance, and even after all these years, Elena felt her heart skip at the love she saw in his expression. He smiled, the real smile, the one that had been buried so deep for so long, and raised a hand in greeting. She waved back, then turned to go inside. There was dinner to prepare, children to wrangle, a husband to love, and a lifetime of adventures still to come. On the 10th anniversary of the gala, Elena stood before her mirror, examining the woman who looked back at her. She was not the same person who had walked into that ballroom with her hidden son and her secret power and her desperate gamble for a different future. That woman had been sharp with fear, hard with anger, brittle with years of loneliness. This woman was softer. Not weaker, never weaker, but softer in the way that water is soft. Able to flow around obstacles instead of shattering against them. Powerful in her flexibility, her adaptability, her capacity to nurture without losing herself. Mama. Mateo's voice came from the doorway. He was 16 now, nearly as tall as his father, with the same steel-gray eyes but a warmth in them that Ricardo had never developed at that age. Papa says you're going to be late. Your father has no patience. He says he's been waiting for you his whole life and he's tired of it. Elena laughed. Tell your father that good things are worth waiting for. Tell him yourself. He's standing right behind me. Ricardo stepped into view, and even after 10 years of marriage, 10 real years, not the hollow shell that had come before, the sight of him still made her breath catch. He was older now. Gray threading through his black hair. Lines around his eyes that came from laughter instead of cruelty. The tattoos on his knuckles were faded slightly, but the word they spelled, Potra, still proclaimed his legacy to anyone who cared to look. But the power he wielded now was different from the power he had once sought. It was the power of a man who knew who he was and what he valued. The power of a husband, a father, a leader who had learned that the strongest thing he could do was love without reservation. You look beautiful, he said, crossing to stand behind her. His reflection joined hers in the mirror, and for a moment they simply looked at themselves, at what they had become, what they had survived, what they had built. I was thinking about that night, Elena said. The night everything changed. The night you destroyed me in front of everyone I knew. The night I gave you a chance to become someone worthy of being destroyed. He laughed, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. You have a way with words. I learned it from you. All those years of watching you negotiate, manipulate, persuade. I was paying attention even when you thought I wasn't. I should have known. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. I should have realized from the beginning that you were the most dangerous person in any room we shared. But then you wouldn't have underestimated me. And I wouldn't have had the element of surprise. True. He turned her in his arms, tilting her face up to his. Elena DeSantis. Wife. Mother. Partner. The woman who saved me from myself. I love you more than I have words to express. Then don't use words, she whispered. And he didn't. The evening of their anniversary they held a celebration at the estate, smaller than the gathering 10 years earlier, but no less significant. Their children were there. Mateo, tall and serious, but with a smile that came easily when he was with family. Sophia, 10 years old and already showing signs of the strategic brilliance that ran in her mother's line. And the twins, Marco and Isabella, who had arrived unexpectedly 5 years earlier and had been causing cheerful chaos ever since. Antonio was there, older now but no less sharp. He had officially retired from the business 3 years earlier, content to play the role of beloved grandfather while his daughter and son-in-law managed the empire he had helped rebuild. Marco Benedetti was there along with his wife and children, because somewhere along the way Ricardo's right-hand man had become family too. And around them, filling the gardens with laughter and conversation, were the allies and friends they had gathered over the years. People who had once feared Ricardo DeSantis but now respected him. People who had once pitied Elena but now admired her. People who understood that the family at the center of this gathering was something rare and precious. A dynasty built not on fear but on love. As the evening wore on and the children grew sleepy and the stars emerged overhead, Ricardo and Elena found themselves alone on the terrace where so much of their journey had unfolded. Any regrets? Ricardo asked, his arm around her shoulders, his eyes on the sky. Elena considered the question carefully. There had been so much pain. So many years of loneliness. So many moments when she had wondered if hope was just another word for foolishness. But there had also been this. The children. The love. The transformation of a cold king into a warm husband. The discovery that she herself was capable of more strength, more grace, more forgiveness than she had ever imagined. No regrets, she said finally. Every moment of suffering brought us here. And here is exactly where I want to be. Even the worst moments? Especially those. They taught us what we could survive. They showed us what we were willing to fight for. She turned to face him, her hazel eyes meeting his gray ones. They made us who we are. Ricardo nodded slowly. Then with the same deliberate grace that had once made him terrifying, he dropped to one knee. Elena's breath caught. What are you doing? Something I should have done properly 10 years ago. Something I should have done before we ever exchanged vows the first time. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a ring that glinted in the starlight. Elena Varese DeSantis, will you marry me? For real this time? With full knowledge of who I am and who I'm still becoming. Tears were sliding down her cheeks, but she was laughing too. Laughing at the absurdity of it, the beauty of it, the perfect rightness of this moment. Yes, she said. 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger. A new ring, different from the one he had given her so many years ago. This one was simple, elegant, with a stone that caught the light like captured starfire. I had it made, he explained, rising to his feet. The jeweler asked me what I wanted it to represent. I told him, everything. Every moment we've shared. Every tear we've shed. Every laugh, every fight, every reconciliation. I wanted it to hold all of it. Elena held up her hand, watching the light play across the stone. It's beautiful. You're beautiful. He cupped her face in his hands, those tattooed fingers gentle against her skin. You are the most beautiful thing that has ever happened to me. The most unexpected. The most transformative. I spent 40 years learning to be cold, and you undid it all in a single night. With a single look. With a single question. What question? He smiled, remembering. You asked me if I was capable of being loved. Do you remember? That first night after the gala, when everything was still raw and uncertain. You asked me if I believed anyone could really love me. I remember. I didn't answer then. I couldn't. The question was too big, too frightening. He leaned his forehead against hers. But I know the answer now. The answer is yes. Yes, I am capable of being loved. Because you love me. And your love has made me capable of loving in return. They stood there as the stars wheeled overhead, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the home they had built and the family they had raised and the future they were still writing together. And when they finally walked back inside, hand in hand, they both knew the truth. This was not an ending. This was just the beginning of the rest of their lives. 20 years after that first gala, Elena sat in the garden where she had once painted her family in roses and hope. She was older now. Gray threading through her dark brown hair. Lines on her face that told the story of a life fully lived. But her eyes were still bright, still sharp, still filled with the quiet authority that had once brought the most powerful man in the country to his knees. Around her, her grandchildren played. Matteo's sons, Sophia's daughters, the twins' various contributions to the family's next generation. They chased each other through the gardens, their laughter echoing off the ancient stone walls. Their joy proof that the cycle of pain had been broken. Ricardo found her there as he always did. He was slower now, moving with the careful deliberation of age, but his eyes were warm when they found her face. Warm and still filled with wonder. We did it, he said, settling into the chair beside hers. We actually did it. Did what? Changed the story. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers the way they had 10,000 times before. My father raised me to be a monster. I was supposed to continue the cycle, cold to my wife, cruel to my children, creating more monsters to carry on after I was gone. His voice was thick with emotion. But look at them, Elena. Look at what we built instead. Elena looked. At the children laughing in the sunshine. At the estate that had been transformed from a house of fear into a home of love. At the family that had grown from secrecy and sorrow into something expansive and joyful and real. You built it, she said softly. I just showed you it was possible. You showed me everything. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. You showed me that I could be different. That I could be better. That the past didn't have to determine the future. You did the work. Because you believed I could. His gray eyes held hers, still burning with the intensity that had first captured her attention all those decades ago. Elena, I have lived a life that should have ended in tragedy. I should have died alone and unmourned, surrounded by people who feared me and nothing more. Instead, I'm sitting in a garden with the love of my life, watching my grandchildren play, knowing that when I'm gone, I'll leave behind something better than fear. We both will. We both will, he agreed. Together. As always. They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon faded toward evening, watching the children play, feeling the weight of all the years behind them and all the moments still to come. It hadn't been an easy road. There had been pain and betrayal and moments when it seemed like everything would fall apart. There had been fights and forgiveness, tears and laughter, darkness and light in equal measure. But through it all they had chosen each other. Again and again and again they had made the choice to love. To fight for something better. To believe that transformation was possible, that hearts could change, that even the coldest king could learn to warm. And in the end that choice had made all the difference. I love you, Elena said, the words as natural as breathing after all these years. I love you too, Ricardo replied. Today. Tomorrow. For every moment we have left and every moment after. The sun set over the garden, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The children's laughter continued, a symphony of joy that echoed through generations. And two people who had once been strangers, who had once been enemies in a way, sat hand in hand and watched the light fade, content in the knowledge that their story had found its perfect ending. Not in power. Not in conquest. But in love. Always and only in love. This story was written for you, for anyone who believes that change is possible, that love is worth fighting for, and that even the darkest hearts can find their way to light. Thank you for walking this journey with us. Please like, share, and subscribe. The end.